this video, we're going to be building an awesome gaming PC with this AMD's brand new 6650 XT. Is this the new mid-range graphics card that gamers are going to be flocking to buy? I guess there's only one way to find out. And in this video, we're going to be assembling a full system featuring a Ryzen 5 5600X, 16 gigs of RAM, and AMD's latest and greatest GPU, or at least one of their 3 latest and greatest GPUs. Let's do this.
Ready, set, go.
The Corsair iCUE 5000T provides the ultimate in airflow, RGB lighting and mounting compatibility for PC builds in 2022. With 3 alloy fans included, 160 addressable RGB lights in the front, roof and floor panels, Corsair have really taken things up a notch. Learn more about the awesome 5000T in our build videos over on the channel or at the where to buy links in the description below. Now let's start, shall we, with a bit of background as to what the 6650 XT actually is. It launches alongside the 6750 XT and 6950 XT as almost a midlife replacement for those cards. You heard me right, replacement. The old 6600 XT, 700 XT and 900 XT are going to be gone. Goodbye. And these new cards will stand in their place. In the case of the 6650 XT, with a small price bump to boot actually. AMD are obviously doing this to try and combat the increasing threat of Nvidia's Ti cards, especially the recent RTX 3070 and 90 Ti, and in our case today, provide something just that bit more competitive for 1080p gamers. With 8 gigs of video memory, it sits on par with a 3060 Ti, but with less VRAM than a 3060, though it looks like AMD haven't made the same memory mistakes as they did with 6500 XT here, which is great to see. You can find a full review of the 6650 XT over on our website, but don't go anywhere, because later we will be doing detailed video benchmarks, looking at performance and all that jazz. For now though, let's go ahead and get the rest of our build built up, and then we'll install and look at the GPU in more detail that little bit later on. At the heart of this build is the MSI B550 Tomahawk, which is the motherboard I've elected to go for when building this mid-range system. I decided in this video to do an all AMD build, being able to take advantage of features like AMD's Smart Access Memory, and just build an awesome Team Red system with no Nvidia or no Intel in sight is a satisfying feeling. Although AMD's Ryzen 5000 architecture with these B550 motherboards is looking a little bit long in the tooth against a backdrop of new Intel 12th gen chips, they still deliver great performance and come at a cheaper price point, especially the motherboards, which also leverage cheaper DDR4 memory for all of the motherboards available to buy. Whereas with Intel, things are a little bit more muddy. This Tomahawk board from MSI comes packed with features: 2.5 gig and 1 gigabit Ethernet, USB-C, overclocking for the CPU and GPU, PCIe Gen 4 support. It ticks lots of boxes. And despite being around for about 18 months now, is most definitely not obsolete by any means. We're going to go ahead and install into the motherboard the Ryzen 5 5600X, my CPU choice for this build. 6 cores, 12 threads and some great base and boost clock speeds deliver really solid performance. And as I say, being able to leverage Smart Access Memory, which is where your CPU can actually use your GPU's VRAM in addition to your system DRAM, is a great advantage of going for an all AMD build. Your Intel processor can't leverage this on an AMD or Nvidia graphics card for that matter, as it's a Team Red proprietary feature, at least for now. Pull up the retention arm on your CPU socket and drop the processor into place. Nice and easy. Be careful with the processor, as AMD chips are more delicate than their Intel counterparts with pins on the bottom. Bend one of these bad boys and you are, quite frankly, stuffed. Once the processor's in, we can move on to the memory. And for this build, I've picked up a 16GB optimized for Ryzen kit of Corsair's Vengeance RGB RS. When it comes to buying memory for AMD CPUs, there's a few key rules you need to follow. You need to go for 2 DIMMs or more to ensure dual channel performance, providing double the bandwidth for your processor. You also need to go for 16GB or higher. 8 gigs is frankly not enough in 2022. And you need to make sure it is 3600MHz or above. Going for cheaper memory on Ryzen can really hurt performance, we're talking like 10-15% frame rate loss in some scenarios. It can be quite picky, but don't panic. Get a kit like this and you're going to be A-OK. To install the RAM, we're going to use the 2nd and 4th DIMM slots. That's these ones just here. We're going to line that RAM DIMM up, slide it into place, and apply a bit of pressure to each side. Repeat the process for as many RAM DIMMs as you've got, in our case just the 2, leaving the 1st and 3rd slots empty. Great for future upgrades and great for that dual channel performance right now. To round things off on the motherboard, we're next going to pop in our storage. And for this build, I've picked up a Seagate Barracuda 510 in a 1TB capacity. Quite a tongue twister there. With read and write speeds in the region of 3.5-3.4 gigabytes a second, it's plenty quick enough for the latest GPUs, while also sitting at a price point that doesn't break the bank. Latest pricing and availability can be found at the affiliate links in the description below. If you want to go ahead and build this system for yourself, or just learn more about any of the components we're talking about. Slide your SSD in at sort of a 45-degree angle and fasten down with one of the tiny screws that comes included with the B550 Tomahawk. And that last step is actually installing the cooler, or at least most of it. Now for this build, I've gone for an aftermarket unit. The stock cooler is not bad for real budget systems, but for a system like this where a bit of overclocking is a possibility, it makes sense to go for something a bit higher end. Now this is Cooler Master's Hyper 212 RGB Black Edition, a basic single tower cooler that will do a much better job than the included one. We talked about this in more detail actually in a video we made last year. Worth a look for sure. Now to install the cooler, you need a specific set of mounting hardware, which I've laid out in advance just here. I'm going to talk you through what each bit means. These 2 bits on this side are going to go on the cooler itself using these small screws. This provides us with fastening points in the correct locations for our AMD AM4 Plus socket. We're then going to pop these plastic stoppers and these screws into the included backplate, which we'll get out in just a moment. They're going to slide underneath the bottom of the motherboard and fasten down with these female to female posts. Once those are on, we can add the cooler on top, and the whole thing is like a big CPU cooler sandwich. Just to recap, backplate first, pop this through the rear of the motherboard, then add on your cooler on top and secure it down. Leave the fan off and we're going to add this in later once we've popped the motherboard into the case. And once the cooler's on, we can move the whole thing into the case. This is actually quite heavy. And this right here is the Deepcool CK560. Now, you know me, on the channel we like to feature some weird, wonderful and slightly different cases. And this one is a personal favourite of mine recently. With a really cool RGB design up front, great build quality and affordable price point, it works well. I'll link this alongside some great alternative options in the description too, to give you guys plenty of choice as to what the best case to buy in 2022 really is. It's all about getting a case with the right form factor, airflow and feature set for the build you're trying to put together. One thing I forgot to mention as well is that these RGB sort of cutouts at the front also act as great airflow additions as well, keeping all of your components nice and cool. What we're going to do is we're going to take off both of the side panels, the tempered glass and the rear steel panel first of all, to make way for installing the motherboard. Quite nice, these case panels actually have captive thumb screws on, which stops the thumb screws falling off when you remove the side panels. Normally at this stage of the build, we check that all of the standoffs are in the right place for the motherboard. But because this is a full-size ATX case, and we've got a full-size ATX motherboard, we haven't actually got to do that today. Instead, we can go ahead and slide the motherboard straight into place. The rear I/O shield will then pop through the rear I/O. It's integrated on this case, saving us a handy step. We can then add our 9 screws in, 3 at the top, 3 on the middle and 3 across the bottom. Finish things off by popping on your CPU cooler fan, and the motherboard assembly and case are all complete. And we can move on to the power supply before looking at the GPU in just a moment. The unit I've selected for this system is Deepcool's DQ650. I've gone for this power supply for a few reasons. Primarily, the 80+ gold certification and 10-year warranty were definitely a big pull, as was the fully modular interface on the rear that allows us to only really plug in the cables we want to connect. Because this build is a fairly simple system with a low wattage requirement, all we need to do is add in a motherboard power cable. I'll show you how to plug these into the motherboard in just a moment. A dual 6+2 pin PCIe power harness, that's going to power up the single 8-pin connection on our graphics card. We've then also got an 8-pin CPU power connector adapter, and to round things off, a SATA power harness 2 to power up the RGB hub in our system. No old SATA SSDs or hard drives, but you'll use this cable for those if you do actually have them. Spin the case all the way around and just move any of your front panel connections out the way, take the power supply and slide this into place. You want the fan actually at the bottom to pull in fresh air from underneath the case, and slide the unit towards the rear. Add in 4 screws to secure the power supply in, and then plug up your motherboard's power cable, the largest of any today, the CPU power connector to the top left corner of the motherboard, and we'll add the GPU power cable in when we actually install the graphics card, which is our next and final step of the build process. We're then able to round things up by looking at the 6650 XT. Now, I don't want to ruin the conclusion for later on in the video. However, what I will say is that this looks like a GPU that performs better than a 3060, the card AMD seem to want people to compare it to, but worse than a 3060 Ti, which on paper has the same MSRP. However, of course, in the current climate and with how manufacturers choose to price cards, the big differentiating point is going to be how expensive it is. If this card can actually be found for $399 and lots of manufacturers hit MSRP, not impossible now we're in a more relaxed GPU climate, then this is a great buy. It's a fantastic GPU for that price point. But if actually this is selling for more like $450, I think it's a pretty poor buy, at least when it comes to next-gen GPU standards. It's nice to see AMD upgrade the 6600 XT, but to make it obsolete at a higher price point seems like a kind of sneaky thing to do. But once again, it all depends on what this retails for. The good news is that AMD's own 6500 XT, which by all accounts was bad, is actually pricing itself very competitively. And AMD cards have fallen in price dramatically, so it's not unlikely that $399 or even lower could become the norm for the 6650, in which case it's a pretty decent pickup for your next build, providing that important performance edge that the 3060 just misses out on, without the legs at 1440p of the 3060 Ti. I am a bit of a fan of this MSI Gaming X cooler. Of course, it's not a Gaming X Trio because it's only got 2 fans, and it's going to look really, really nice in our RGB build today. I think there's a bit of RGB lighting on the MSI logo, but otherwise it's pretty simple, with a nice metal backplate, hopefully helping to alleviate GPU sag and just looking that bit more premium. We're going to go ahead and pop it in the top PCI slot by pushing the clip downwards and sliding the GPU into place. We've already gone ahead and removed the PCI lanes, so it's just a case of screwing the card down and giving it power with a single 6+2 pin PCI power connector. And once that's done, the build is pretty much ready to go. We're going to test some detailed performance benchmarks shortly, looking at a wide range of the most popular titles. But first, we need to see how good this awesome looking build looks when it's all powered up, in the only way we know how. I'll see you in just a few ticks, but first, roll that montage. Ready? Now that we've seen just how good this build looks when it's all powered up, it's time to take a look at performance. Does AMD's brand new 6650 XT cut the mustard? I guess there's only one way to find out. We'll be looking at comparison graphs in literally 20 seconds, but before then, we're going to show you a summary of all the results we gathered. Choose your favourite title, and you can instantly see what frame rates we were able to achieve with these brand new AMD GPUs. Let's take a closer look title by title, and start things off with GTA 5. It's an oldie, but it's a goldie, and here at 1080p high in the in-game benchmark mode, we saw 151 frames per second on average. This was a fairly decent average frame rate, and when compared with the other cards this competes against, it fell very slightly short of the 3060, though did beat out the 6600 XT. Not a great start for AMD, but it actually gets quite a lot better from here on in. The first example of this is Battlefield 2042, where at 1080p high settings, we pulled in 105 frames per second at that 1080p resolution. If you go ahead and then compare this to other cards out there, you can see that the 6650 XT actually beats out the 3060 here, and by quite a margin, 8 frames per second. It gives us a 10 FPS boost as well over the older 6600 XT that this GPU replaces, and knocks fairly closely 8 FPS away on the door from the 3060 Ti. It's a similar story in Call of Duty Vanguard, where here we tested at 1080p high settings with AMD's FSR 2.0 tech enabled. Using the resolution scaler in this instance gives us a really good idea of the performance. And here I'm happy to say that the card beat out the 3060 and even the 3060 Ti on some of our runs. 181 FPS in one of the latest AAA titles at high settings at 1080p is very impressive indeed. And the good trends carried on through into Forza Horizon 5. Here we tested out at 1080p ultra settings, and we managed to achieve 97 frames per second on average. This did fall short to the 60 Ti, but beat out our 3060 by more than 10 FPS, and beat out the 6600 XT by 5 frames per second. Moving on to Apex Legends next up, here we tested at 1080p high settings. We managed to pull in 190 frames per second on average, a really strong result that showed the 6650 XT's ability when it comes to straight rasterization. This actually came very close to the 60 Ti within a single frame per second, beat out the 3060 by 30 frames, and beat out the 6600 XT by 32. Wow! Here the card performed amazingly well. These sort of first-person shooter titles without any DLSS or ray tracing is still where AMD excels, and I was really pleased with our results. Moving on to Fortnite next up, here we tested out at 1080p high and 1080p competitive settings. At competitive, we pulled in just short of 140 FPS, 137 to be precise. This beat out the 3060 and 6600 XT and was level pegging with the 3060 Ti, perhaps indicating more of a CPU than a GPU bottleneck here. If we tune down to competitive settings this time around, here we tested at 1080p with everything down to low, except the render distance, which we set to far. The 6650 XT did very well here, and while it did lose out to the 60 Ti by about 24 FPS, it still beat the 6600 XT, isn't that a relief? And more importantly, the 3060, a card that AMD's last gen mid-range option struggled to compete against. Finally, to wrap things up, we also tested out Call of Duty's Warzone, another hugely popular title in 2022. Here we managed to achieve 123 frames per second on average when testing with our 6650 XT. A very favourable result for AMD that showed some solid performance across the board. And with that, that pretty much wraps it up for our testing and build of the 6650 XT from AMD. What do you guys think of the cards? Let me know below, and make sure to check out our full review and verdict linked in the pinned comment. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.